So I'd just like to give a short welcome to country and really thank our ancestors and the original people of this land for maintaining the land so beautifully and for having all their miles of eel tracks and their miles and miles of swaying grain that they had when the first discoverers arrived here. And also, you may be aware that they discovered recently, after the fires in Victoria, suddenly they discovered that there were 9,000-year-old stone buildings there, made by some of the most ancient stone homes on the planet. So we know that the original people here were really extremely civilized and organized. So I thank them, all the elders, and from the present and the ones coming to maintain this land again. I noticed that they're getting the original people to start fire burning in some areas, so that's a really good sign. Get the people back active on their land again. So first of all, I'd like to welcome John Shipton, the father of Julian Assange, who we're delighted to have again. And he has spent the last decade traveling the world, doing everything he can to have a truly sustained effort towards the release of his son, Julian Assange, who all of us here, I'm sure, love and respect and want to support in whatever way we can. So he's visited the Ecuadorian embassy, he's visited Julian in Belmarsh High Security Prison many, many times, and he's been to so many court appearances, and he's done everything he possibly can. He's on this massive tour. He's just come from the Nimban Mardi Gras where he spoke. I bet that was fun. And then he went yesterday to the International Press Freedom Day in the West End. It's also Labor Day rally, May the 1st? And from here he goes on to Lismore. If any of you have friends in Lismore that would like to attend his next assembly. And there he's got the mayor of Lismore supporting him. And he's going to talk in that space in front of the gallery on Keene Street. But I don't know the time, so we'll have
1 p.m.
1 p.m. So anyone who's got friends in Lismore, please go to that. And then he's back to Byron again, and he's going to have a rally in Railway Park from 12 till 2 on Friday, this Friday. And that's also got the support of Sarah Nujan, our deputy mayor, who is wonderful and a long-time supporter of Julian. So please come on Friday to Railway Park. And then he goes on to Coffs Harbour, Bellingen, Port Macquarie, Newcastle, Sydney and Canberra. So he's on a mission. And then he flies over to Britain, where he's on an even more of an epic journey going around the country there. And then finally he goes over to the US, where he's going to plead with Joe Biden to release his son. Woo! Yay. John, come on up to the stage, please. I'd also like to mention, just because it's something very close to my heart, and I don't know if the guys will go there, that Julian now has this beautiful fiancée, Stella, and 2 young sons, Gabrielle, who's 4, I believe, and Max, who's 2. And of course, she's a lawyer. She got her MA in Oxford. She's fluent in Swedish, which was very helpful for Julian during the Swedish trials. And she's also fluent in Spanish, which was useful for the Ecuadorian embassy. So my heart goes out to Stella, and I just really want to wish that Julian can get free as soon as possible. So next I'd like to welcome to the stage Jacob Gretch, who worked for WikiLeaks for a long time. He's been working on issues of peace and social justice for more than 40 years, focusing on the armaments industry in particular. And through most of that 40 years, it's been the armaments industry, particularly, I guess, if he lives in Britain some of the time, which of course sells more armaments probably than almost anyone except America to the world. So he campaigns against the arms industry, he goes to trade fairs, US bases, and he works on the Australian militarism here. He works with WikiLeaks and the Assange campaign, and is based on joining the dots between the forces of oppression. And he says, at the heart of every just cause is the cause of justice. So let's have a warm Mullumbimby welcome also for Jacob. And then we're really delighted, Mandy Nolan said yes at the last minute. So we're delighted to have Mandy with us as well. And of course you all know really she's a comedian, an author, a journalist, an MC, a keynote speaker, a humour therapist and a comedy instructor, just a few things. She's taught at least 1,000 people, including many of my friends, how to be funny. And she's even taught people with dementia how to look on the bright side of life. So she even did a TED talk on that topic. I wonder if she managed to make the Sydney Parliament House laugh as much as she does around here. She's a regular columnist in The Echo and an influential social commentator. Not to mention she has 5 children, so how does she do it all? Maybe tonight we'll get a few clues. So let's welcome Mandy to the stage. And we have another wonderful person who's not quite arrived yet, so we'll save a seat for him. But in the meantime, we're delighted also to have Mia Armitage, a youthful journalist, and she works with Bay FM. She writes articles for the Echo, and she's actually won the award 3 years on the run for her work in local commentary, in her journalism for local commentary. So come on, Mia. And Mia's going to ask Mia's going to ask some questions. And then, and Mandy may throw in a few as well. And also then we have the audience who can ask questions after that. So first of all, we're going to start actually with Jacob, who's going to give us an introduction to the situation in hand. Thank you, Jacob.
Thanks, everybody. Just going to start to give you a little bit of an overview and let John fill in some of the details and others. Currently, Julian is still sitting in a cell in Belmarsh. All right, now can you imagine this? We have an Australian citizen who has committed no crime under Australian law. He committed no crime in the United States. He's committed no crime in the United Kingdom. He's being held in a small cell that is built for terrorists in the United Kingdom without charge, with no charge whatsoever, at the behest of the United States. And I see one of our speakers, Kieran's arrived today, and he might talk a bit more about that. But what I wanted to talk about, I guess, today is the ongoing work. Because a lot of people assume that Julian is now inside Belmarsh and that's the end of the story. But I want to point out a few things. First of all, I've only got limited time because you're here to listen to John. Not more than you are me, I'm aware of that. But the important thing is that people assume that because Julian is locked away in Belmarsh, that that's the end of the work. But I've got to tell you, WikiLeaks continues to work. First of all, people continue to post information, documents, whatever, to WikiLeaks. And WikiLeaks still has a team going through documents, passing them, ensuring their veracity, redacting what needs to be redacting, and publishing. And even more importantly, WikiLeaks is one publisher that has never had to retract, any story it's ever published. Regardless of what you think of the stories, each and every last one of them has proven to be true. There is no other major publishing house in the world that can make that claim. It is WikiLeaks. They have redefined journalism. And even more importantly, part of what WikiLeaks is, part of the brilliance of Julian, just part of it, the mathematical brilliance, was in developing the anonymous Dropbox system. So people can post to the WikiLeaks site, you can post to the WikiLeaks site if you have any information, and after it's gone through and the veracity is checked and all the rest of it, it will be published. If it's true, it will be published, and of course in the public interest. No one's really going to worry too much about shenanigans at the local bowls club, I think. But the Dropbox system that Julian developed that lay at the technical heart of WikiLeaks is a system which is now employed by every major publishing house in Australia and in the world. The ABC, the New York Times, the NBC, Fox, all of them use the same anonymous Dropbox. So even if WikiLeaks had been stopped, even if WikiLeaks had stopped publishing, even if nobody sent anything any longer to WikiLeaks, that work continues. And that's the important thing. But we're here to bring Julian home. We're all going to bring Julian home, yeah? Because it's not a matter of are we. It's not a matter of are we. We are going to bring the bugger home, all right? We're going to bring him home. And the important thing to me, personally, this is just a personal thing, is that when he comes home to an Australia where he knows that his struggle was not in vain. His imprisonment was not in vain. You wouldn't believe, I go the length and breadth of all over the place talking about this campaign, and you wouldn't believe how many people, maybe you would, have never actually accessed a WikiLeaks site. I'm asking you today, think of places you've worked. Think of your local politicians. Think of the companies that are raping the earth, destroying the planet, killing the people. Put their names into the WikiLeaks search engine, wikileaks.org. It's a very easy website to use. It's built by the best computer nerds in the world, let's face it. Just pop your boss's name, pop your local politician's name in there and find out the truth about what they're saying. Because that is what is going to make Julian's time in the embassy, in Belmarsh, under house arrest, and all the times before that, worthwhile. We need to continue the work and not just bring Julian back to Australia, because we're going to do that, that's not a question. It's a question of when, not if. But to bring his work back to Australia. And that's why we're here on the Home Run for Julian tour. John and I and Ian and Rain and various others have come and gone. We've travelled through rural Victoria and New South Wales. Now we're doing northern New South Wales. You're in Brisbane the other day. We're talking about where we'll be in a couple of months' time when John gets back to the US. And that's what we're doing, is saying to people, it's personal, it's local. WikiLeaks, these news, they're not just about London, Paris, Munich, New York. They're about what's happening here in your local area. It's about, I know one of the issues around Mullumbimby, for example. I was talking to a heap of people today on Burringbar Street outside Santos. And what kept coming to me was land prices and housing affordability. And it's not a major leap of consciousness to direct that towards the banks and the international trade laws and the land laws, all of which are exclusively covered in information that Julian has helped. So it's not just about overseas, it's about here in Mullumbimby, it's about your spy stations in Brisbane, it's about your military bases in Lismore, it's here at home where the hammer falls, that we all need to work. Not just to bring Julian home, but to bring home the issues that Julian has been publicising and the issues that Julian is in prison for. Julian himself said that if wars are started by lies, peace can be started by the truth. So I ask you, each and every one of you, get onto wikileaks.org and learn the truth. And until then, we do what we can to bring Julian home. Thank you all for listening to us and inviting us tonight.
So let's welcome Kieran O'Reilly. He is an amazing activist. He was outside of the Ecuadorian embassy and Belmarsh prison for ages, and he's been to all the court appearances. He's been one of Julian's most long-term activist supporters. And he has a real claim to fame because at one point, the planes from the US Army were taking off to Iraq at the beginning of the Iraq War from Southern Ireland. And so Kieran managed to smuggle himself into one of the great hangars of the US Air Force there, and with a hammer, single-handedly bashed the nose of one of these military planes and created such damage that they couldn't fly, so he actually stopped it taking off to the war in Iraq. Even better than that, was that the Dublin jury actually acquitted him sometime later, of the $2.5 million damage he did with that hammer. And then they went and gave him the hammer back as a souvenir. Yeah.
Thanks very much. I really come to this issue to standing in solidarity with Julian as a former prisoner of the United States. I served 13 months in prison there at the outset of this war. This war is now 30 years old, and 2 weeks before George Bush Sr. Launched what was the equivalent of 8 Hiroshimas on Iraq in the 1991 Gulf War. Four of us managed to break into a US Air Force base in upstate New York and disable a scramble alert B-52 bomber. And unfortunately, other B-52s from that base the next week were deployed to England and dropped napalm, cluster bombs, fuel air explosives on a daily basis on the people of Iraq. It was a massacre. It's not really a war. War is usually when you've got two groups fighting. It was really a massacre of naval and aerial bombardment where only one country had a navy and an air force. And Australia was, I remember being in the States, the first cab off the rank was Bob Hawke to join this war effort. It of course comes at the end of the Cold War and the disintegration of the Soviet Union. So we ended up on trial. We had Ramsey Clark giving evidence, who's a former Attorney General of the United States under LBJ, and all sorts of other good witnesses. But the jury wasn't allowed to hear any significant testimony, and we were sentenced to a year in prison. I served most of my time in a small county jail in Pecos, Texas. I was the only white guy. It was caged with 24 people and 6 cages welded together, so that was pretty intense. Before getting the more traditional punishment of transportation to Australia, which is a joke that works in Ireland but doesn't work in Australia. So how the war changed then was it turned into genocidal sanctions, and there was very little resistance to that, but very little anti-war resistance left after the massive military victory of the first Gulf War. But people like Kathy Kelly and Voices in the Wilderness began to break those sanctions. Madeleine Albright, when she was confronted with the statistic of 500,000 children under the age of 5 had died because of the sanctions, she came up with the genocidal response. We think it's worth the price. And then, of course, it escalates to 2003, and you have the invasion and occupation of Iraq. And at that point, I was living in Ireland, which was, of course, neutral in World War II and other imperial wars. And their neutrality really comes out of their militant anti-conscription movement that was echoed here in Australia. The government was defeated twice in referendums on conscription in World War I. So we were arrested disabling a US Navy warplane that was en route to Iraq. We sent it back to Texas and were initially imprisoned, then put on trial 3 times. The jury unanimously found us not guilty in 2006, which is when, of course, Julian starts WikiLeaks. And I think you know, we've really been at war for 30 years. The war has escalated and expanded into Syria, into Yemen, and across the Middle East. And all that the government and the war machine or the beast requires is our silence and sedation to us to avert our gaze and not make the connection of Australian troops leaving Gallipoli Barracks. I live on the back fence of the Enoggera Barracks in Brisbane, that's where I grew up. And there are Australian troops in Afghanistan at the moment, and there are also bombers from Amberley Air Force Base bombing indiscriminately in Syria. So it's a very real thing, but you wouldn't realise we were at war because the media, the mainstream media, is there to distract us, to bury stories, and, you know. And like I always reflect too, like we're very proud that Julian was born in Queensland in Townsville, but another Queensland journalist, Gretch, who exposed what was going to happen in East Timor a month before the Indonesian invasion in 1975. And his memory was really buried by the media in Australia and his fellow journalists, you know, as was his other four newsmen who were also massacred and butchered in Ballabo. I think what WikiLeaks did is, as this war ground, the occupation ground on, was to put it back front and centre with, you know, when you're on trial, I hope you don't have to be on trial, but the best evidence you can provide to the jury is from a hostile source, you know, from the police or from the military. And that's what WikiLeaks did. They presented evidence directly from the US military. And that's why they've never had to retract anything, because it's raw, you know, evidence. It's the massacre in Baghdad, the collateral murder massacre. It's the military's filming of it and recording of it, and that really put it back on the agenda. And that's why they found Julian such a threat. And I was there when he was first appeared in court in 2010, December 2010, living in London at that stage, and he looked pretty isolated, and it looked as though some of the most, you know, brutal forces in the world were circling him. And I began to go to the court appearances, and then my godson, who'd been in the British SAS in Baghdad, who'd converted to being a Catholic pacifist, and I began to do the security for Julian to get him in and out of court. And then eventually Ben Griffin would train Julian in boxing, still within the pacifist parameters apparently, in the embassy, and we staged many vigils. And then in the year leading up to his extraction, they became very concerned, and we now know through some British politician who's writing his memoirs that organised the extraction, that was real, that the Brits were really hungry to get him out of there, and the Ecuadorians were dragging their feet. And so, you know, in those and it was a very weird situation. Ecuadorian embassies located in the wealthiest part of London. There was just heaps of, you know, Saudi princes and Russian oligarchs, and Jose Mourinho, manager of Manchester United at the time, living around the corner. And there was just a heap of ex-special forces, ex-SAS, doing security work in the area. And then you had layers and layers of security. You had special branch with their own set up an apartment directly opposite the embassy. So to be there on the street, I was living there for 6 months on the street, and to witness all this security circulating, you knew it was a very, very serious issue. And by the end, they had one police station, they had a direct feed from outside the embassy, they had a direct feed to Ecuador, and a direct from inside the embassy, and a direct feed, I believe, to the CIA in the United States. And then Julian was extracted, taken to Belmarsh, which is, you know, Category A prison where they had the Provisional IRA in the 90s, and completely unnecessary to put him in a Category A prison, you know. And, you know, they kept him there hoping he'll get COVID and hoping he'll get sick and die, basically. And it's, you know, to resonate with him as someone who grew up in the same movement that many of us grew up in, the anti-nuclear movement and the campaign against uranium. He had so many of the same references, even like, you know, he was a Midnight Oil fan, Many of us were. And, you know, and to see someone from our environment, and we're born into a very privileged environment, you know, whether we're in Western Europe or the United States or here, and it's someone very much like us, suffering very much like them, the other, who were under the bombs in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Yemen, etc. And yeah, it was a real privilege to be able to meet him, befriend him, and to accompany him through the courts. And I think of any serious movement, and it looks like Peter Dutton would make a Queensland Copper Defence Minister, I don't know. But it looks a bit like Peter Dutton is now frog marching us to a major war, a little closer to home. That, in any serious non-violent anti-war movement will have prisoners, and we have to develop rituals and a culture to support our prisoners when they're behind bars. Because I spent 2 years in prison, from Bogger Road to Texas to Ireland, and you know, it's designed to isolate you, to demoralise you, to convince you that you're forgotten, and we have to proactively counter that. And the only anti-venom is our solidarity. Thank you.
Hi everybody, thank you for coming.
Is it a bit low?
It's just I'm practicing a theatrical dramatic delay. Okay. Again, thank you for coming. I'd like to just quickly address 3 areas: virtue, quality, and redemption. So, virtue. Taking upon us, as we have done, taking upon this noble task of bringing, put upon the citizen of Australia, put upon to the extent now that it's 11 years, the UN declaring Julian arbitrarily detained, the UN declaring Julian psychologically tortured over the period of 9 years, the UN declaring that Julian was mobbed, the UN declaring mobbing, the UN declaring calumny after calumny, lies, smears. Taking upon ourselves this noble task produces a quality in us and what we do. That quality you can see in Peter Whish-Wilson. Forgive me for mentioning names, I normally don't, but Peter Whish-Wilson, a senator from Tasmania, Green. Andrew Wilkie. Years ago, I went and met these men, and since they have taken up this task, their stature has grown concurrently with the support for Julian worldwide and amongst us, to the extent now that Andrew Wilkie in the Federal Parliament has the power to take on Crown casinos over their corruption and high rollers and so on, laundering money. This is really important. Second part of the quality is it brings back to us the truth of the beauty of parliamentary governance, where we take our concerns to parliamentarians, and the parliamentarians take their concerns into Parliament. And as a sovereign majesty, the sovereign majesty of Parliament takes those concerns to the executive and said, fix this situation. Now I know I simplify, but I do, to point out the beauty of that technique, or that means of governance, and the power of the quality that we, you, I, Jacob and the others have created, a real quality that brings back in evidence the real beauty of parliamentary government. And I know that institutions of state, the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, or great corporations like, well, there are, you know, there are heaps of them, they're not worth mentioning, they envy envy the power of Parliament and suborn to their own use. However, what we have done, what you have done, is brought back into evidence the real beauty, a quality, that where our concerns are taken into Parliament, taken upon themselves by the parliamentarians, and then insisting that the executive obey the majesty of the sovereign majesty of Parliament, renews the beauty. So we have done that. We have. It's not complete, but it is demonstrated to all the parliamentarians, and they, you know, parliamentarians, they gossip a lot because you've got to know what X or Y is up to, otherwise you get into trouble. Or you can get into trouble or keep out of trouble or follow a movement so that will bring benefit to your constituents. They are aware of this quality. Next. This truth seemingly can only be spoken about poetically. It seems to me. I've learned that. So redemption, the final part. Gideon Polya, an academic in Melbourne who specialises in being able to calculate excess deaths, that is, in the waxing and waning of our societies, it's possible to foretell the number of deaths and the number of births expected and be able to calculate more if there are more deaths than expected. There's a very unusual thing about us. If you take in Wales, just to demonstrate this quality, that it has a truth within it, the decade to decade deaths from suicide in Wales, they've kept the figures for about 250 years. Decade to decade, they don't vary much, about 3.2 per 1,000 people. Decade to decade, over 250 years. Yet suicide is the most personal of events. However, in a society, it remains consistent. Very interesting. Human beings are absolutely fascinating. So we use that understanding and we use poetry to get to a point where we understand the possibility of redemption. Though Gideon calculates his book, I have at home, it's not a very popular book, it's full of figures that you don't really want to know. Calculates that over the 21 years since the beginning of the destruction, or what they call the reordering of the Middle East, there have been about 6 to 7 million excess deaths. He also calculates what that cost to the societies that have been involved in the provisioning of those deaths. That is Australia and the United States. But let's leave that out. Leave that aside. Makes it too complex. 6 to 7 million. These are human beings with mothers and fathers and sisters and uncles, aunties and children, grandfathers, old fellows like me who have learnt too much in a long life.
Let's try swapping mics, because that was getting a bit, and you can just hold that anyway.
There is a pall of grief that floats like a black thunder cloud above the Middle East. You could cut it with a knife. How to unbundle some of this grief? Brown University calculates, and they're very serious people, the university in the United States, there are 37 million refugees wandering the world with their families or by themselves, looking for a place to live, to stay, to drink water, and to foster their children. I can see a couple of them here. Serious business, 37 million. So I travel in the Middle East, and there, like Chile, South America, Julian is more or less held in great affection, almost idolized. I don't want to use the word idolized, but just to illustrate it for you. And they had no benefit from truth until Chelsea and Julian publicised what actually went on. They love Julian. So redemption will come when we give them a little bit of hope that the person who brought them the truth, a moment of truth in their suffering, we fight for his freedom. That's redemption. They see that a person who's brought them a moment of truth in their great suffering, in the destruction of their 7 countries over 20 years, that person is supported and fought for in the country of his origin. So poetically, it's the only way we can feel a truth. Intellectually, of course, we can understand that 37 million and 7 million, it's gigantic, it's monstrous, it's horrible. But that doesn't move us very much. But to bring about, just to grind up all that ore and bring a sliver of gold, that is the knowledge that the person who brought them the truth, that society cherishes him, and in so doing ensures that the government of that society acts to free him from the persecution that he's undergone. On a more, so I leave that there and put the guillotine through and move. Worldwide there's a lot of support, and it's increasing in Bolero, how it increases in tempo, and that tempo is increasing. I don't know when the moment will come, but it is increasing. In Germany they have 29 cities have the vigils, they call them vigils, once a week for Julian. In France, yesterday was May Day, people marched all over France supporting Julian with flags. In Spain, similarly. In Italy was the country that organised the Council of Europe to make the declaration of support for Julian. The Human Rights Commissioner for the Council of Europe made a declaration of support for Julian. The Austrian government made a declaration of support for Julian. The President of Mexico made Obrador, I should say his name, made a declaration of support. So we're not by ourselves. It is an upwelling, and it's a great task we've taken on, and the rewards have been great. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Is that okay? Is that too quiet?
Yeah, neither of them. It's the speaker, unfortunately. Speaker wire.
Oh, that's all right.
Yeah, we get confused.
We need you to do a little bit of Reiki on the speaker wire. With some energy. Just let me fix this a little bit because I'm there. Happy now? Is that okay?
Yeah.
Thank you so much. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners, elders past and present, those emerging. I'd like to acknowledge that this is Bundjalung country, that the sovereignty was never ceded, that this is and always will be Aboriginal land. So thank you very much to the speakers, and thank you very much to John as a father. I stand here as, I think very much as a mother and as a partner. And when I look at the story of Julian Assange and I hear us speak about him, it's sometimes easy to get lost in the mission of what that man has created. And I think sometimes it's good to stand back and to see his humanity, to see his vulnerability, to see his need. As John pointed out, you know, those who are persecuted, and in particular we're here tonight talking about Julian Assange, he is a father, he is a partner, he is a son. And we fight not just for the legacy, which is incredible, of what he has created and the voice that he has. We fight for him as a fragile human being who deserves our protection as a sovereign land.
Yeah. You do.
And that is what we should be here to do. I can only imagine, sorry John, I'm turning around, I'm getting old and you can't turn around with your whole body going like But as a parent myself, I have 5 children, and I have been an activist since I was 17. I was kind of brought up to have a strong belief in social justice, a belief in change, a belief that you cannot be idle, that to be idle is to be complicit. I went on to study journalism, and I have always carried that with me. I don't think I have anywhere the bravery of someone like Julian Assange. As a mother, I look at my children and I want them to carry the fire. I want them to care about truth. I want them to be change makers. I don't want them to sit in a system and just consume. I want them to ask questions. I can only imagine what it must be like, this curious mixture of pride and sorrow that you must feel as a man like John Shipton, who's been an activist, in a son like Julian Assange, an extraordinary, brave and courageous activist, but still a man at risk in another country who is getting more unwell the longer that we leave him there. So yesterday John was talking about all the people all over the world that have stood up for Julian Assange. And the one country that is loud because of its silence is ours. It's our country that doesn't acknowledge. It's our country whose democracy refuses to celebrate, acknowledge and protect someone who was in fact enacting the basic tenets of democracy. That is the great shame and hypocrisy. Thank you. So I've got to put my glasses on because I have to actually have something to read that's like a fact. So, I do have, because yesterday, as you know, was World Press Freedom Day, not that you'd know by listening to any of our media. It's not something they celebrate. I don't think they want people to know there's such a thing as World Press Freedom Day. Because we have the most concentrated media newspaper industry out of any country with the exception of China and Egypt, and they're not liberal democracies. So World Press Freedom Day means fucking jack shit in this country. We have excessively concentrated media power in the hands, as you know, of a few owners, which creates unchecked ties between politics and the elites in the media. And that's a reason why you don't see the story of Julian Assange in our mainstream media, why it's kept quiet, why it's small groups of people who keep the flame burning. He should be one of our country's great heroes. We celebrate... We celebrate Ned Kelly as one of our colonial heroes, of someone who stood up to the establishment. And yet, as we go on, we start to lose the story of our contemporary hero, of someone languishing in an English prison without charge. It's un-Australian not to bring him back. It's un-Australian not to stand up and celebrate what he has done, and not to actually embrace the anti-authoritarianism that's at the heart of what WikiLeaks is. It should be at the heart of our convict nation, the heart very much of our First Nation. So I guess at the end of this, I was, I was looking at, how Morris and Dutton at the moment are very much, saber rattling for war with China. Using words very much, they love the word sovereignty when it applies to looking out across the globe for people they're going to pick a fight with. But they're not enacting sovereignty right now. Most of you actually probably are aware of our coalition government, the absolute failure to actually protect the sovereignty of our country people and of people of our country by actually threatening to jail people coming from India to our country for up to 5 years. That is blatant racism. That is a blatant betrayal to the Australian people to do that. That shows an absolute disregard and an absolute choice of who they decide is part of our sovereignty and who isn't. We do have, I was actually going through, and I actually went back, someone actually reminded me, said, go have a look in your passport. And they've written very little, and I don't know if you've read this in your passport. It's a tiny bit near the kangaroos. And this is your government's duty of care to you. This is what a sovereign land is supposed to do. This is your Commonwealth government. It's a bit of a blah blah. It basically says the Governor-General of the Commonwealth of Australia, being the representative of the Australian Her Majesty the Queen Elizabeth II, gotcha, requests all those who may concern to allow the bearer, an Australian citizen, to pass freely without hindrance and to afford him or her every assistance and protection which he or she may stand in need. Yeah. And that statement is what protects you when you leave this country. That statement is part of why this government is failing us and failing its citizens by not insisting that we bring Julian Assange home. Yeah. And we have brought people home before. We fought hard to bring David Hicks home. And David Hicks took years to get him out of Guantanamo Bay. He had fought with Al-Qaeda. He was a self-admitted terrorist, but we brought him home. And that was a coalition government. So it is actually possible. Just recently we have academic Kylie Moore-Gilbert, who was held in Iran. We brought her back. Peter Grester was released and deported from Egypt. And at the time, I think it was Bill Shorten, who was, I imagine he was still in opposition there, but probably head of the Labor Party. He actually said, which seems ironic, the day after Freedom of the Press Day, is being a journalist is not a crime. Being a journalist is actually a duty. And we have Julian Assange, who has enacted the duty of what it is to be a journalist, which is to tell the truth. And it is difficult and courageous, and it has cost him dearly. It has cost him his life. It has cost him years of his life. And we as Australians need to tell the story of Julian Assange, because the longer it goes and the longer it's out of the mass media in our country, the more it starts to dilute and dissipate, the more people start to fall for the propaganda that's actually put out there through social media and through what mass media does. So you need to tell the story, and you need to raise the awareness, and you need to push, because it only takes a small percentage of people in this country. I think it's something like 3.5% of the population. If you can galvanise that many people to actually push on an issue, you can push for change. We need to bring Julian Assange home. So fucking get angry and push to make it happen. Thanks. Yeah.
Hello. Yes, it's working. Great. Okay. I'd like to, Armitage, thanks very much for inviting me again, everyone at Turning Point Talks, to be here. It's great to represent local, independent, regional media, and a shout out also to some of the other regional journalists in our area who do cover the story of Julian Assange, because I think they're very proud to call him one of our own. I know you're claiming him there up in Queensland, Kieran, but he did spend some time here in the hinterland as a child too. So I know that at the Northern Star, they've covered the story of Julian Assange. ABC North Coast, I believe, interviewed John Shipton earlier today. Of course, the Echo and Bay FM. So as long as the community here continues to fight for Julian, I think it would be very remiss of our local independent regional journalists to ignore the story. Mandy Nolan mentioned World Press Freedom Day, and I actually have here some comments that have been made by the UN in acknowledgement of World Press Freedom Day for this year. I thought I might just read them out to you. So this year they've got a theme which is the importance of information for the public good. I think it's undeniable that that is something that Julian Assange and WikiLeaks stands for. Yep, I'll shout. This is a message from Audrey Azoulay. He's the Director General of UNESCO. The theme of this year's World Press Freedom Day, information as a public good, underlines the indisputable importance of verified and reliable information. It calls attention to the essential role of free and professional journalists in producing and disseminating this information by tackling misinformation and other harmful content. The 3rd of May acts as a reminder to governments of the need to respect their commitment to press freedom. It's also a day of reflection among media professionals about issues of press freedom and professional ethics. Just as importantly, World Press Freedom Day is a day of support for media which are targets for the restraint or abolition of press freedom, and a day of remembrance for those journalists who lost their lives in the pursuit of a story. Julian Assange hasn't lost his life, but he's certainly lost livelihood and a quality of life. So, again, I think it's undeniable that we here this week are acknowledging and remembering Julian Assange, World Press Freedom Day or not. There's also been some mention of the level of support for Julian Assange in our federal parliament here in Australia. There is still a group called Parliamentary Friends of Julian Assange. I just had a quick check. Doesn't seem like the numbers have grown much since I last checked when John Shipton was on the Northern Rivers about 5-6 months ago or so. 24 members. All the Greens, members of the Greens are a part of that group. Here in New South Wales, we do have one of the senators, Susan Templeman. Her name is from the ALP. So there's somebody that you can call, email, hustle on social media. What's she doing? She's just put her name as someone who supports Julian Assange. How is she pressuring her party, even though they are in opposition? How is she pressuring them to come up with some sort of policy that would appeal to Julian Assange supporters in the next federal election? And how beautiful that John Shipton mentioned, well, he used the word beauty of parliamentary governance, given that tonight on this panel we have someone who's not only a journalist, a comedian, a mother, a humanitarian, a political activist, but now has decided to throw her hat in that ring. Mandy Nolan, of course, has announced her candidature for the federal election on behalf of the Greens right here in the Richmond electorate. We have invited Justine Elliott several times to these kinds of events in the past. She's the member for Richmond for Country Labor. She's yet to make an appearance at any of those. Okay, let's get to some of the questions, because I know that you'll have questions yourself, and we're going to make some time for that at the end. John Shipton, I'm going to cut to the chase. You said that you're going to be heading to the States to speak with Joe Biden. Now, he's just had his first 100 days as President of the States, but we've already heard he doesn't have any appetite for releasing Julian Assange, so how do you hope to change his mind?
Hello, is this working? Is that work? In the Human Rights Division of the current administration in the United States, we have a couple of friends in the Human Rights Division of the current administration in the United States. More importantly, the appointment of Eric funny how you get these blanks. The new Department of Justice head of the Attorney General, Merrick Garland. He's a supporter of the First Amendment, and he doesn't like very much the national security state. He keeps well away from the national security state. So, just briefly, William Barr, who under the Trump regime was the Attorney General, he was CIA representative at the Church Committee 1974, then 4 years after that, 4 years after that, is a CIA office. He lives down the road from Langley. His appointment by Trump resulted in changing of the upper echelons of the Department of Justice to Kirkland Ellis employees. They were employees of his firm of lawyers. They were all willing to pursue the extradition of Julian Assange. Principally, that's why they were appointed. William Barr, under Bush the Senior, had the nickname of the Snatcher because he was willing and capable of manipulating extradition treaties and manipulating the Department of Justice and the prosecution in order to bring to the United States what I call judicial abductions that the United States wanted. There's a few examples I can give you of using that technique. One, of course, is Julian, a publisher who they want to demonstrate to the world that they're willing to destroy the lives of a publisher and journalist who makes comment or makes available national security information. Secondly is Meng Wanzhou, who's the CEO of Huawei, and the United States wants to avail itself of the technology that exists in 5G in Huawei. Third one is Mike Lynch, who's an IT specialist, an Englishman, and they're currently attempting to extradite him to the United States. And in the reverse, there's Harry Dunn's killer, Anne Sakoulis, the CIA officer who killed Harry, who's riding home on his push bike, he's 14, and then was secreted straight away out to the United States, and the United States refuses extradition requests from England. So that's the circumstance. That's what the extradition treaties are used for in its entirety. And the Biden administration is appointing its own supporters to the top of the Department of Justice, so that we will see changes. Also, we're in contact with some members of the Sanders family, and the current administration in the United States is nominated as Obama-Biden 3. So you can expect the same disingenuous charm that Obama managed to disseminate around the world, and particularly demonstrated with the freeing of Chelsea Manning, and I expect that they will use the same with Julian Assange. So it makes if the administrations are seen by other nations in the world to be willing to negotiate, to be willing to be diplomatic.
Julian Assange, who makes if the administrations are seen by other nations in the world to be willing to negotiate, to be willing to be diplomatic, then it's to the United States' advantage. And so they will, in my view, seek to dissipate the worldwide concern that's built up over Julian. That must be the world's longest answer, I think. So,
oh no, you've given me far longer ones before. But John Shipton, the case for extradition over in the UK, the US made it clear that they were going to appeal Judge Brait's decision, which was that Julian Assange couldn't be extradited on mental health grounds.
the spokesman, the national security spokesman for the Department of Justice, Mark Raimondi, who you're quoting there, was front-running the Biden administration, Mark Raimondi, and the national security advisor in the Department of Justice, William Barr appointees. At that stage, Merrick Garland hadn't been appointed. Also, hadn't been appointed. He was still facing Senate selection or Senate examination to see whether he was suitable to be Attorney General. There's one other aspect. There's one other aspect. So 4 days before Mark Raimondi made his comments that they were going to pursue Julian until the end of the 24 of the world's largest NGOs, Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, all the large ones, 24 of them put an open letter in the New York Times supporting Julian. 24, okay? So in politics, you know, it's like action and reaction are equal and opposite. So as soon as that came up, the equalizer came out in Mark Raimondi's statement. I hope that.
It sounds like a couple of key factors have actually changed, significant factors when it comes to the case in the UK and also politics in America. And though Biden, I'm just trying to sum it up here, although Joe Biden himself has said that he's not interested in freeing Julian Assange, you're hoping that some of the key influences around Joe Biden, that you can influence them. Is that a fair enough summary?
It's too early to make, forgive me, I don't mean to contradict, but just to say specifically, it's too early to make those sort of conclusions. The matter's still in flux. It's a
difficult problem. They don't want another. I imagine, you know, you can see Merrick Garland sitting down with the advisors, his advisors in the Department of Justice, and saying, well, I don't want another effing court case. Every court case over there, it uncovers more of the manipulations of the CIA and so on. I don't want any more, he would say. Particularly as now in Madrid, it's covered up the entirety of the US ambassador to Germany in Robert Grenell's involvement on behalf of the CIA and in causing the AC Global, the security firm in charge of the security, the so-called security at the embassy, to involve itself in the recording of every single moment of Julian's life, the lot in this embassy. And a lot of that is irregular. It's a prejudices procedure. It's irregular. If the Australian government, how can I say this? If our governance had more courage, or I don't know that that's the word, if our governance understood that the unity of the polity is their strength, not their second-rate arrangements with a branch of the CIA that wants to drag Julian out of the embassy, that the unity of the polity is the strength of government, and the unity of the polity comes about as the government stands behind its citizens, particularly in circumstance where they're put upon. That's the point I'd like to make. But it's too early to judge. It's an influx, but however I imagine that the Department of Justice wants a solution to this mess that they've made for themselves.
I'm just going to put two more questions to you, John Shipton. Sorry. You've been in Australia now for how long? About 9 months, I guess. Yeah. Yeah, okay. And have you managed to garner any more significant political support here for your son in that time?
Yes, the support grows day to day. Last week, Peter Khalil, who's the member for Wills, joined the group, the Assange group. So there's now 26. So in 1 week we have 2 more members. It's the 26, and there's another 4 who make themselves known but haven't joined the group. That I'm here.
Sorry, John, are you able to tell us which parties those 4 members are from?
Peter Khalil is the member for Wills, Labour, and Bridget Archer is the member for Bass in Tasmania. So those 2 have declared. Bridget is Liberal.
Okay, and finally, just let us know how is your... Ooh, that's bad. How is Julian Assange now? Since how's he going?
Well, Julian is not the best, but what happens is that what we do in these tours and your support feeds back, because everything, as you see, there's no television channels here so everything feeds back into social media, and social media is instantaneous worldwide. So other prisoners are able to have, communication with their loved ones, and Stella has communication with Julian. The lawyers do. I do on occasion. Yesterday morning, I tried to give a full report. And the full reports have to be concise and quick because there's a guillotine of 10 minutes. So what happens frequently is you get into a conversation and chop. It's quite frustrating, as you can imagine.
Can I just add something to the Australian? Just add something. I'll actually go without this. Yeah. Just add something to the Australian political situation, and I've got to presage it by saying I'm not a member or a supporter of the Australian Labor Party, but at the Australian Labor Party biennial conference, which was held online this time a couple of months ago, policy was passed unanimously to support bringing Julian home. Okay? The ACTU has passed it, Julian's own union, your own union, my own union, as a journalist. The MEAA moved it to the ACTU. The ACTU is calling on the Australian government to bring Julian home. Yes. It is growing in the last 12 months in leaps and bounds. But the point is, with the Australian Labor Party coming on board with a policy to bring Julian home, when you think that the Morrison government's got a majority of 1, and 2 of his members, Christensen and Barnaby Joyce, believe it or not, are on our side, are on Julian's side, and Andrew Wilkie is, and Adam Banter the Greens is, there are actually more people in the lower house who want to bring Julian home than want to keep him there. So part of what we're doing, and it's not just talks like this in Mullen, it's all kinds of things us mob and other people are doing around the country, you can see the impact it's had over the difference in the past 6 months. So we now have a majority in Parliament supporting Julian Assange coming home.
Yeah.
Sounds like right.
Okay. Here's my big loud voice. Does that work?
Yeah.
And Mandy, if you want to ask a question at any time, please jump in. But this one's going to go to both Kieran and Jacob, who have been campaigning for peace for much of their lives. I just wanted you to try and make that connection for us back to Julian Assange. We know him as a symbol of press freedom, but what about him as a symbol for the sort of work that you do? What has drawn you to Julian Assange's case? And where do you see Australia in the global context when it comes to war and peace? We now have a defence arms manufacturing industry.
Yeah, I find it easy to speak when I stand up. I'm from a very particular background. I'm from an Irish Republican family, and in my teen years they would drag us off to monthly Kayleys to raise money for families of prisoners in Belfast and Derry. So, solidarity just came naturally as an assumption that if you're in some kind of struggle, you have prisoners, you support them. So, to use an English phrase, it's with quite a lot of disquiet and dismay that when 2 million people marched in London against this war that Chelsea Manning and Julian Assange were in prison for, And there was such a weak response from that British anti-war movement to someone in their own city, surrounded by the special branch, and also Chelsea Manning, who did a lot of her growing up in Wales and Haverfordwest, where her mother was from, where her mother met her husband, who was in the US military. Chelsea was born in Oklahoma. When they divorced, Chelsea came back to Haverfordwest in Wales. Chelsea speaks Welsh fluently. So there you had someone born in the UK that should have been celebrated by the 2 million people that marched in London, celebrated by the anti-war movement, just ignored and blanked. And they've really come very late to the party, but thank God they have, and thank God that Amnesty International have finally come. But for those 10 years of living in London, it was quite despairing. And I think there's something at the very heart of the Australian spiritual problem, and that is that we find our security in serving empire. Whether it's the British Empire, we look uncritically at Gallipoli and we celebrate that massacre and that suicidal invasion. That year on, year out, that the peace movement evaporates on Anzac Day. There's no discussion about, why was conscription defeated twice in referendums. Australia was more polarised in World War I than it was during Vietnam. And that history is just airbrushed. Like they'd like to airbrush Chelsea Manning, but they don't like to airbrush Julian Assange, and they did airbrush Greg Shackleton for many years. So, where security comes from is not serving empire, it comes from peace and justice and reconciliation with Indigenous people. And these are major, major spiritual problems that people have to address. And, to see Dutton kind of beating the war drum, wanting to go to war with China, and these folks have heard the story before, but it's a bit like my experience outside the embassy one day. I was there 100 days without a shower. I was pretty grumpy, and people would be making cynical remarks. And one day, this very big black American with 4 other well-dressed black Americans were walking by, and he stopped and said, "Is this where Assange is?" And goes, "He's a traitor." And I got a bit of a temper on me, so I jumped up. I started moving quickly towards him, and he was bigger than me, and he started shaping up like this. So I kind of put on the brakes, and I said, "Look, mate, he's Australian, he can't be a traitor." And I said, "I spent a year in jail in your country." And he said, "Well, I spent 3 years." And I said, "Oh, what jail's you in?" And then I said, "Oh, my name's Kieran O'Reilly, what's your name?" And he goes, "My name's Shannon the Cannon Beggs, 2 times heavyweight champion of the world." So when I see Dutton squaring up to China, I think that really reminds me of a very big mistake. And it's great that you've come tonight. I mean, we're obviously an older demographic. I came in at the end of the Vietnam War, but they're the fumes we're running on in terms of an anti-war movement in Australia. And part of it's, the sophisticated techniques of brainwashing and social control they have in young people, and part of it's how, people like us have been at it for 40 years, are pretty exhausted. Part of it's, that this man, Julian Assange from Melbourne, was at the right age with the right gifts to lead a whole techie-savvy generation in rebellion against empire. Empire worked that out, and they've worked out how to neutralise him. And they've got all the resources to do that, and it's only people like ourselves who are still willing to gather around this issue that there's any hope in it.
Well, I might add, I'll try to be brief. Just a little personal story. Back in '83, I was in Adelaide. I was only at Canberra. I was only a young bloke, and I ended up being interviewed on the radio about nuclear power. They were talking about nuclear power in Canberra. They're going to build something in Jervis Bay. And it was clear to me that the ABC reporter was pro-nuclear. And he said, "What would you say if I told you most people in Canberra thought you were wrong?" And I just had an inspiration. I said, "It's the same we made most people in Canberra think. Fucking fantastic, man. It's bigger than we'd set out to be, And it came to me then, I said, as long as all we want people to do is think, and we want people to know the truth, and as long as you know the truth, and as long as you're prepared to say to your kids or your grandkids in 20 years, 30 years, 50 years down the track, yeah, I know it was a risk, these hippies came to town and told us it was a risk, but I thought, what the fuck, let's give it a shot. As long as you're prepared to tell your kids and your grandkids that, then do whatever you like. We're not going to say you can't have it. Just man up, person up, firm up, and tell the truth. And what Julian has done, he's exposed a lot of information, but a lot of it is stuff we already knew. We already had rumours of. We knew the CIA was operating in Pine Gap. We knew American military were committing war crimes in Afghanistan and Iraq and all other places. We knew the deals that were being done by dodgy politicians, both in Australia, Labor and Liberal, and the United States, with corporations and lawyers. We knew the dirty tricks behind the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the other international trade deals. We knew all this. But until WikiLeaks, we weren't able to go, oh, here it is, mate. Here it is, chapter and verse. Here's the document. Here's the email. It's no longer our word against theirs. The only way you can not know that this whole stinking edifice is built on lies and corruption is if you choose not to read what even they are telling you is the truth. And that's what Julian done. And that's how it relates to war and peace and environmental degradation and every other issue under the sun. He's exposed the truth and shone the light into the darker recess of capitalism where the bosses would rather it not be shown.
Jacob, just to stir the pot a bit, the great thing about truth is you have to change your mind. And we currently, whether it's a state of whether it's a human condition or whether we've started to move towards more of that kind of ground where we tribalise through belief, which is not informed by truth. So how does that impact? Are people going to come across, because I feel like we're more and more becoming polarised into silos of belief of it doesn't matter that it's the truth. People have made their mind up and they're not willing to let the truth through.
Well, someone, and it happens all the time, with very, very many different issues. And to some point, we do it ourselves. When people tell us information about truths or perceived truths that we hold dear. And it takes, I've had to do it just recently as 5 years ago. I organised a barbecue for refugees outside a refugee detention centre on Melbourne Cup Day, celebrating the Melbourne Cup. Now, of course, that would be anathema. And it's changed my mind. And the activists who were working on animal cruelty against horse racing took a few years to change a bloke who learnt to do his reading, writing and arithmetic at Harold Park, I tell you. But we do change our minds. And I think it's only through the constant pressure. Yeah. And we are being siloed. But part of that constant pressure, you think, for example, I went to a demo against Adani, the Quit Coal people were doing in New South Wales, and we went there with the WikiLeaks stuff, and they said, what's WikiLeaks got to do with this? And I went bang, 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 and I brought them up all the emails proving how corrupt Adani was going back to 1972. And that's what changed their mind. So it's bringing them in, it's bringing into your own particular issue.
Andy, I've got a question for you as a journalist and as someone who's entering federal politics. And it's around press freedom and also around Julian Assange. I'm wondering, there's so much going on in Australia. Obviously the pandemic is at the top of most people's minds, and they'll be thinking about that when they go to the polls. We don't know when that will be. Then we've also got climate change, a huge topic of conversation. That's one that you've spoken about. Locally, we've got the housing crisis. How are you going to bring this issue of press freedom back into a national conversation? Do you think you can?
I would hope so. And as someone that has first-hand experience working regionally, and it's a huge, I did my, I studied journalism at university, and I actually failed because of my inability to be objective. And I was told you know, because it used to start, the old way journalism degrees used to work was you'd start off and it was like you'd have, clearly it was before privatised systems where you can't fail anyone because you won't get money from them. So it would start with 500 people, and the second semester would be down to, it was like being on, like, you know, kind of journalism Survivor. And then you were down, second semester you were down to 200. And then second year, it was only 2 semesters, then second year you'd start and then you'd be cut down to something like, was it like, you know, 80. And then it started, because at the end only 40 people graduated. I made it to the beginning of my third year, and then I took acid right before my final, well, that final exam for that semester. I didn't get to the last semester. And I think I wrote my best piece of prose I've ever written, but they wouldn't give it back because they said it had to be submitted to the Dean of Arts because he liked it too. So in that, it was funny being told that there was no role for subjective journalism. I was far too engaged in, I wasn't objective, I could always see, and then and it was kind of funny, so I kind of gave up. I went, wow, well if I can't, I don't think I can be objective sometimes because it feels wrong and I need to tell this story and I want to editorialise. Ironically, years later of not having done anything, and then 20 years later, 20 years ago coming here and working for an independent newspaper, which I love, which has started, what I love about The Echo, you can like it some weeks, you can hate it, you can whatever, but that is a newspaper that has lasted for 35 years, which is built on the conversation and the difficult, pain in the ass community that we are. And we're not always compliant, we're not always in unison, we don't always agree, but we have a voice and we have a platform to argue and discuss, and I think that's incredibly important, even at a small level. I mean, you're not doing, the Byron Echo isn't kind of, it's not at WikiLeaks level, it might occasionally, but I think it's the ethos of what great journalism is an independent media does that. So in a sense, coming back, and it's funny, I made my way back into writing by having a column which is entirely subjective and clearly so.
Can you speak up, please?
Give me a microphone.
Yeah.
There you go. Is that better? Oh, no, I'm not starting again. No, so one of the great things, I always say it's an enormous privilege to have a voice in a community where you're allowed that kind of subjective input, and there's so many voices that, through our letters to the editor. So in that sense, it's an issue, it's going the long way around, but starting with that, that's an issue that's incredibly important to me, which is around the issue of press freedom. We have a media that's, absolutely dominated, by a very small number of corporations. Our elections are decided very often about, depending on how that's going to run. Murdoch has always been a big player, and Murdoch really impacts the way the Labor Party behaves, because the Labor Party don't want to get a negative narrative from the Murdoch media. Neither do the Liberals, but they rarely do. So they control that. Now we're looking at the ABC, which I think is like a form of domestic violence, the way that the coalition have pretty well kicked the teeth in on our auntie. The ABC, which you could always turn to, is now very much a gagged media. And yeah, we have other medias to go to, but ABC is our public broadcaster. And when it comes to speaking on media freedom, yeah, I would be talking about media monopolies and having to do some reform around the way media is constructed in this country, and also around the ABC. Because, people are, I had someone the other day who I know very well within the ABC who's very well known, who sent me a private email going, really excited about what you're doing. That's really fantastic. I just have to let you know I can't publicly support you. And that's how noble they are, where they cannot come out and publicly support you. I do regular spots with Richard Glover on 702 in Sydney. And when I said, oh look, I've just become the Greens candidate for my region, why don't you just introduce me as Manly Nolan comedian and Greens candidate for Richmond? He goes, I'd really love to, but I'm not allowed to. So if I introduce you as the Greens candidate, I also have to introduce a Liberal or coalition candidate. And I went, well, do you have any here? And he goes, no. But you can't, because that's how, right down to that. So you're not getting a free and open voice. And I say that's where we have to have that, because we're about to lose an incredible asset. And once you lose your media, you lose your ability to keep a pulse on what's happening in your democracy and your government. So it is incredibly important. So yeah, I'll definitely be having that conversation. And I get full support of the Greens on that as well.
Let's throw it open to the audience. So anyone got any questions in the audience?
I'm just going to go to the toilet.
I've got, I'm not all that eloquent, but I just simply want to know what you think the everyday person can do in some way that actually can get somewhere with this. I don't know whether that's a question or what, but, I've heard a lot of, as was said by Jacob, we already know a lot of this. We've known about it for a long while. Obviously not the general public, but, it feels hopeless at times, and I can see how tired you guys are, taking this team around. And I'd just like to hear something that could be helpful, where just I may be able to participate, but just the general person.
My experience as a prisoner, anti-war prisoner, you can't underestimate the power of a letter or a card, not only to remind the prisoner they're not forgotten, but also to send a warning to the guards and the staff that they're not forgotten. The first month I was put on Con Air and flown from New York to the Mexican border to El Paso and shipped out to Pecos. And the first month I was probably close to a breakdown. I couldn't speak Spanish, all the orders were given in Spanish. I was getting harassed by members of the staff who were also National Guardsmen. Some had served in the First Gulf War, and also attacked by Mexican gang members. And as soon as the amount of correspondence came in, the attitude towards me changed dramatically. The staff backed off immediately, realising I had reach on the outside, and probably went and picked on someone who didn't. And I became a celebrity, especially amongst the stamp collectors in the jail. And then also in messages of, you get the sense eventually that your presence in prison is significant to a lot of people struggling for peace and justice, and in turn, people's continued struggle for peace and justice is significant to you. So hearing reports of actions, whether they're in solidarity with you personally or whether they're continuing against the war making, war preparations, is all significant. There's a saying, I don't know if it's an Irish saying, but we'll claim it. People die twice, once when they expire and once at the last time their name is mentioned. It came up recently. It was in a movie, I don't know. But, that's, as soon as the name of a prisoner starts evaporating and disappearing, you're in trouble, because it's all about how they conduct, war in prison is probably human beings at their worst, there's some very beautiful moments in both war and prison, but most of it is designed for barbarism, and especially the US prison system. Like, when I was in prison there was 1.3 million, now it's 2.4 million. And where they will put Julian is in a hole with special administration procedures, with contact with anyone. They've got 80,000 people in solitary confinement in the United States prison system. In Europe, and Gareth Peirce, who's Julian's lawyer, she's very celebrated in Ireland for freeing the Guildford Four and the Birmingham Six and the Maguire Seven, etc. She wrote a great article in the London Review of Books maybe 10 years ago, saying that all extraditions from Europe should cease to the United States, because under the European human rights thing, human association is seen as a human right, like access to water, ablutions, shelter, clothing. But in the United States, I think it's Article 7 it's being interpreted at the moment, they don't see human associations and human rights. So they've got 80,000 people slowly going crazy in solitary confinement. So we have to develop, I look back at the anti-war movement and you think, was it a movement, was it a phenomenon? Some of the big political groups who used it and marketed themselves and exploited the phenomenon while it lasted were incredibly silent when people like Chelsea Manning, Julian Assange went to jail. But even before that, when those of us who carried out non-violent resistance to war went before the courts and went to prison, and members of the military, there was more serious anti-war resistance that came out of the US military that came out of the US peace movement in terms of people being court-martialed, refusing to deploy, and obviously Chelsea Manning being the most significant through the whistleblowing. So, I think if 1% of the people who marched against that war in 2003 had gone to prison and non-violent resistance, both civilian and military, and the other 99% just didn't go home, but developed a culture of solidarity with their prisoners, we could have stopped that war, or at least have a healthy anti-war movement today.
And to write to Julian, just go writejulian.com, writejulian.com, and it'll give you all the instructions, addresses, how much postage, etc.
What is Julian's actual situation now? Is he still in 23 hours of solitary? What's his situation?
Thank you. Yes. So since March last year, the jail's been in COVID lockdown. He's had one visit in 12 months and no sight of lawyers in 12 months. Gets a 10-minute phone call externally, that's outside the UK, for only to family, and 20 minutes to Stella and the kids. He's 23 hours in so it's, but it's not nice. It's the equivalent of, it's the equivalent of solitary confinement. But something odd, so that after March last year is the last visit I had, then Stella and the kids got a visit. They lifted and the circumstances of the visit are that it's a room about 3 times the size of this, but they only let in about 7 prisoners and their families. The rules are that the prisoner has to dress in full PPE, that's a gown, mask and those shields, those plastic shields and a hairnet. And then the guard instructs Julian and Stella that if the kids embrace Julian, or Stella embraces Julian, he will have to spend 2 weeks in solitary confinement.
Cruel torture.
Is he allowed books and tapes or CDs? Is he allowed some kind of...
He has a... so they took up a petition and an FOI, a series of FOI fight. Julian's movement from the complete solitary confinement in the hospital wing. Hospital wing is a quad, everything is actually pods. So you have an open area and a few cells around it. His movement from there, that was full solitary confinement, because he was under, so they say, under observation. So the prisoners put in a petition to move Julian from the hospital wing to the over 50s wing, and that petition failed. So they put in another petition, and that petition failed. So the prisoners put in yet another petition. So after three petitions from the prisoners in the jail, Julian was moved into association in the over 50s. That's from the prisoners in the jail.
John, how long can you be held with that charge?
Forever.
Forever?
Yeah. Remand.
Wow.
Sorry, without charge. Sorry, that's wrong. In Sweden, you can be held, remand goes on forever.
Wow.
In Sweden, you can be held
In Sweden, you can be held without, on remand is indefinite. That's in Sweden. In the United Kingdom, to be on remand, you have to be charged. The circumstances for extradition prisoners are a little bit different. I don't know the law there, but they are different.
Yeah, I mean, they've got some pretty weird laws in England under not just Prevention of Terrorism Act, but they've got people detained who've never been charged with anything, who can't see the evidence against them, and it's a real kind of dual reality. But I'd like to re-emphasise the point that, you look at the moral bastions in London of, very well-paid human rights NGO bureaucrats and Labour Party people with the anti-war movement stuff, and their silence about Julian, and then you look at the human response by prisoners who've got, the most powerless, the most despised people. And I ran into George Christensen on the street. I know he's not everyone's favourite politician, but he went to visit Julian in Belmarsh, and he told me the story. He said while they were waiting for Julian to be brought, a prisoner also waiting for a visit realised who they'd come to see and started speaking out about the injustice towards Julian. Now this guy, he's got no power. He's in a maximum security prison. He's probably going to lose his visit. The risk he's taking, the jeopardy he's in to speak that truth. So it's surprising where solidarity comes from. It really is. And the British, like when I was facing deportation from the United States, they threw on overstayed a visa and being guilty of a crime of moral turpitude. And I asked the guy, what does turpitude mean? I'd never heard the word. And it's usually, some high school teacher being sexually inappropriate with a 12-year-old or something, that's what turpitude is, something innately wicked. And my act had to do with a B-52 bomber that was older than I was. They were built in the 1950s and they're still bombing today. And that was just to throw it on, to make it difficult. And then I was dealt with in Alexandria, Virginia, where they're trying to extradite Julian too. So they manipulate the law, and it's incredibly ridiculous that Julian Assange minimally is not out on bail, electronically tagged with his loved ones. Julian, I think, has a perfect record for turning up to court. Where he didn't turn up to was an airport, but every court appearance he had, he turned up to, and there was no, the electronic tag worked for 2 years. And I think they're just in there to hope he gets sick, I mean, a miracle if he doesn't COVID in there.
It's torture.
I just want to thank everybody. I get a feeling of the wrap coming, so I just want to make sure we thank on behalf of the team. Rain Sinclair over there, and there's Jacob Gretch and Ian Rose and myself. Just wanted, and hope next time we see you next year, same station, Julian's around the place to say thanks as well.
Well, let's mention Friday again in Railway Park, because John and perhaps the whole team is coming again. Friday from 12 till 2, Rainbow Railway Park. Please come to Byron for that. That would be wonderful. Thank you so much, all of you, for coming. It was really wonderful to have you all here again. And I'd like to announce our next month's Turning Point Talks, which is by a film director who made this film called The Worm is Turning. And basically the title of her talk, Hilary Bain, is Choose While You Still Can. Which system are you feeding when you feed yourself? And that's really looking at monoagriculture and the whole situation of how we grow our food these days. And we're also very happy to have Andrew Cameron, who is Byrondshire's new agricultural extension officer. And he's going to tell us how we can make this beautiful land in Byronshire more healthy and more productive. And you can actually get an appointment with him and he'll come out to your land and say, the land's like this, I suggest you grow this and that. So that should be a really interesting talk. So That is on the 1st of June, easy to remember. And also all our talks, including this one, I'm so sorry about the sound tonight. That's the worst sound we've ever had. I don't know whether it's perhaps a cable loose in the speaker, and I'll get onto the staff here. But all the talks are on turningpointtalks.com. There you can hear all of them, including the last one is now up, and that was pretty interesting. It was sold out. We had 140 people. So please go back and listen to our old talks. And thank you once again, and thank you everyone for coming tonight. And we'll see you on Friday.
See you Friday.